Hey there, this is Anne-Marie, the anti-HR lady, and in this video, we're going to talk about whiteness, white supremacy, and how it impacts the interactions between Black Americans and non-Black Americans in the workplace who are not white. So we're specifically going to talk about the interactions between immigrants and other people of color and Black Americans in the workplace and how white supremacy and whiteness impacts those relationships. Let's get into it. Hi there, I'm Anne-Marie, and this is the Anti-HR YouTube channel. And on this channel, we talk about HR issues, I provide HR tips, and we talk about HR from an employee perspective, and I provide employee-focused advice to help employees understand their workplace rights and assert those rights when they're being violated. I also like to talk about how to spot and identify discrimination in your work environment, so that you can negotiate your way out of those work environments up to and including negotiating a separation with severance. If that's of interest to you, please hit that like button, please subscribe, and please provide constructive comments. We always appreciate those. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about a subject that has come up over and over in my comments. When I did the video recently about whiteness, white supremacy, and white women in the workplace, a lot of people, brought up what about non-white women, and specifically people of color who are not Black and who are not Black American. Some people brought up their interactions that they've had with different immigrant populations in the workplace, and I think all of those issues are valid. So I decided to make a video, and I'd already been planning to make a video about this because I have lived experience around it as well. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how I think whiteness and white supremacy has impacted the relationships between Black Americans in work environments and non-Black but people of color in work environments. And so this is a large population of people, and some of the things I'm going to say are generalizations. They don't necessarily apply to every single individual, but they are definitely common experiences that many of us have had. And I'm going to talk about this subject from the perspective of a person who is a first-generation Black American. My parents are from the Caribbean, from Trinidad and Tobago to be exact. You might hear some of that in my accent. I always tell people my accent is a combination of Brooklyn and Trinidad and Tobago, because I lived in Brooklyn as a child and then moved to Trinidad and Tobago and lived there until I was a teenager. And our speech patterns and so on, I believe, are formed by the time we're like 8 or 9 years old. So I've never really completely lost my Brooklyn accent, but I also have a Trinidadian accent because I lived in Trinidad also during a formative period of my life. So my viewpoints are informed by my experience as a child of immigrants, as well as living as a Black American in the United States and getting to have a vantage point that not everybody gets to have, right? Because I have always, sometimes to the chagrin of certain people in my family, identified as Black American. I've never thought of myself as a Caribbean American. I don't think such a thing exists, honestly. I was born in the United States. I grew up in Brooklyn. And then when we moved back, I lived in Florida, in South Florida, until I graduated from high school and then moved to the Washington, D.C. area, which is where I lived as an adult, until I escaped America and moved abroad to Mexico, which is where I now live. So my vantage point of observing this has been a somewhat unique one, because my parents are immigrants who moved to the United States in the 1960s. I was born here, and my siblings, most of my siblings were also born in the United States. And so my perspective is shaped by that, and also by things that I've observed in the workplace. Also, because I worked in international development for many years, I worked with a lot of people from lots of other places and from other countries. And I also got to travel to other countries. And I have also traveled extensively since I left the United States. So my perspective on this subject is also impacted by that experience. And when people talk about these subjects, they talk about it very emotionally, which I'm not going to do today. I'm going to talk about it probably more from a critically thinking, intellectual standpoint than I'm going to be emotional about it, even though I've had my own experiences. Because I think it's important for us to realize that, first and foremost, the way that these different groups of people interact and treat each other, not just in the workplace, but in socially and so on, is all impacted and influenced deeply by whiteness and white supremacy. And not just whiteness and white supremacy as it reflects in a system in the United States, but also the impact of historic colonialism, which I always tell people is the sibling of slavery, colonialism and its impact on multiple continents across the world, right? So before we get into what is happening in our present day, we should talk a little bit about how we got here in the first place. And of course, as I say, these are all my personal opinions. They're based on lived experience as well as my experience working and managing people, but they're still my personal opinions. And so feel free to disagree, but do so constructively in the comments, because I'm not arguing with anybody on the internet or in my comments. So if you can't make an appropriate comment and you can't, govern yourself, maybe don't make a comment, because I know this is a very emotional, touchy subject for a lot of people. So I'm gonna preface my words by saying that. Govern yourself, because I will delete comments I think are inappropriate, and I will block people. And I will not argue with you. I probably won't even respond. If I feel that your comment is inappropriate, I will just do what I do. Okay, so how we get here in the first place? As you know, if you're even a minor student of history, and a minor observer of politics, and I'll preface this by saying I have a degree in political science, so politics is something I find fascinating, that I studied. I find it interesting. But history is something I've always also found very fascinating. But if you are a student of history, and even a small form, you're aware of the transatlantic slave trade and how Africans ended up in the Americas in the first place. And when I talk about the Americas, I'm not just talking about what is now the United States of America. I'm also talking about Latin America, which is Central America, South America, right? I'm not just talking about the United States and what is now the United States. So, and if you know about the transatlantic slave trade, you also know that, Africans were brought into this region, and some of them were dropped off in the Caribbean, on the islands there to work as slaves, Haiti, everywhere in the Caribbean. And they were also dropped off in South America. And they were also dropped off in Central America. Mexico was a slave outpost for a while. Wonder if you might not know that, but there's a whole history about Afro-Mexicans that a lot of people don't know about. But Google is your friend. It's fascinating if you're interested. And that, slavery lasted the longest in Brazil. Brazil was the last place to abolish slavery in South America. And Brazil was colonized by the Portuguese. So the Portuguese, which were the first explorers, and when you go to Portugal, which I've been, they're very, very proud to talk to you about their explorations. They don't talk that much about the slavery and the raping and the pillaging, but they love to talk about their history of exploration and so on. And when I went there, I asked about the other part, and people get quiet when you talk about that. Portuguese don't like to talk about that very much. But there was a wonderful Afro-Lisbon tour that I went on, where a gentleman from, I think he was from Benin, but he either was born or grew up in Portugal. And he does a tour where he talks about the influence of Africa on Portugal and the history between Africa and Portugal and the impact of slavery and Africa on Portugal. And it's a fascinating tour. So if you're ever in Lisbon, I suggest doing it. And I learned so much about the impact of not only Portuguese on Africans in Portugal, but a lot of what the Portuguese did in some of the places where they went, where the influence is still there. The places like Cabo Verde in Africa, off the coast of Senegal, and places like Brazil, where people still speak Portuguese to this day. All of those places, but there are lots of places Portuguese went first, and then other people came later, the Spanish, the British, the French, right? And Mexico also has a history of, everybody was fighting over it. The Spanish had the largest influence, which is why people in Mexico speak Spanish, why people in so many countries speak French and Spanish. It's not because it's their first language. It's because of the colonization of those places. So when you go to places like Senegal, people speak French. You go to places like Sierra Leone, and they speak French. The names of the places are not even African names. They're names that Europeans gave to them. And I say this all to say that in order, and then we won't even talk about South Africa and the Dutch and the things that the Dutch did in South Africa, with apartheid and the complete almost enslavement, by any other name is still enslavement, of a whole people on their own in their own country, right? By violently instituting a caste system that still stands to this day, even though apartheid is over. The ruling, the people with the moneyed class, and you always know money is what controls everything. Even if you don't see people up in the front lines, the money is what controls everything in the United States and everywhere else. So the ruling class, i.e. the people with the money, are still Dutch in South Africa to this day. The government might be African, but the people with the money who hold a lot of the assets in the country continue to be Dutch, right? And that's the case in other countries in Africa where colonizers came in and might have brought other people after slavery. They brought other people to these areas. They brought Indians as indentured servants. Some places Chinese came. The United States has that history where the Chinese came to build the railroads after slavery was over. They couldn't get Africans to do it. So they had the Chinese come over to work on the railroads and to build the railroads. And then once they were finished doing what they needed, they started passing laws to say they couldn't come to the country anymore, right? Go read about the immigration acts that were passed specifically to keep the Chinese from being able to immigrate after they had them do what they needed them to do, right? So America has a history around discrimination, not just against Black people and Native Americans, the indigenous people of the United States, of the Americas, because they're not just what was the United States. The indigenous people were all across the continent into where Mexico is. If you really pay attention, I came to Mexico. It was fascinating because the people who we call Native Americans in the United States look exactly like the people they call indigenous in Mexico. It's the same people. They just, they moved around, right? Borders and all those things are things that white people created to say where the land starts and ends and who owns what. This was not concepts that Native people had, right? The land was the land and you got to use it, but it never belonged to anyone. The idea of something being owned is something that comes from Europeans, where they go everywhere and they plant their flag and they murder the people who are there and then they say it's theirs. Okay, sound familiar? Okay. So everywhere they went, they inserted themselves, they lied, they stole, they brought Christianity with them, and they used white Jesus to also get their way, right? And to get people to, you could make people more pliable if you tell them that Jesus wants them to do whatever it is that you want them to do. They had slaves believing that Jesus wanted them to be slaves. And to this day, in my opinion, this is my personal opinion, Christianity is still used to keep Black people in line, and Black and brown people, and not just in the United States, all around the world. Christianity and Catholicism is used. Religion is used, and not just a Christian religion, but we're talking about them because that was their religion, right? And they went all over the continents and they inserted themselves and they were controlling, after World War II, they just, they sliced up lots of different places and divided it up amongst themselves. And a lot of those places were on the continent of Africa, right? So when you go to Egypt and you see the influence of the French, for example, it's because they were there and they were colonizers of certain parts of Egypt. You go to Tunisia and people speak French there. And it's because they were colonized by the French. To this day, France has a lot of countries that they allowed to have their independence, still paying money to them. Look at what they did to Haiti. Haiti's been punished forever and a day because they fought and won their independence, and they have never let them forget it, and they have punished them ever since. Haiti's still paying money to France, which should not be the case, backed by the United States. As a punishment, it's nothing else. And they've caused pure chaos over there. So colonization, and I say this all to say that colonization, which is a cousin of, the sibling of slavery in my mind, and is birthed by whiteness and white supremacy, has had an impact on Black and brown people all over the world, not just in America. And I think it's important to understand that, because the way that different groups of people have related and relate to whiteness and white people is very much impacted by colonization and very much caused by colonization and the concept of whiteness and white supremacy. And so we ain't even getting into Asia yet, and how the British went and they colonized India. And they were in India for a very long time, and Indian people had to fight to get the British out of their country. And Gandhi and others who were involved in the movement to get the British out of India, right? But what the remnant of, even after these countries left, so-called left these countries, because they've never really left any of them, they continue to interfere and impact the economies of all of these places, is that over the time that the British were in different places, and the French and whatever, and these are all, Anglo-Saxons, the idea of whiteness and whiteness being superior is something that they brought with them to these places. And so what you see even after they left is people who behave in ways that are constantly aspiring to whiteness, right? And aspiring to whiteness in very specific ways. And if you travel to any of these places, it's easy to see. I have so many experiences, even on the continent of Africa, interactions that I've had with people on the continent of Africa, in multiple countries, in Kenya, in Senegal. And all of it is very clearly about seeking approval, and that they want white people to like them. And they're very subservient, for lack of another better word, to white people. And even as an American, when you go to these places, and I've seen people ignore me at restaurants, right? And part of it is also that a lot of African people, as well as people in other parts of the world, believe that white people have money, because that's historically what they have experienced, is that they come with all the assets and all the different things. So they want to be proximate to that. And they don't think that black people have money. So when they see you, they have a belief about you based on what they think. And all of that comes out of colonization. So they're going to run and go serve the white person first, because they think the white person is going to leave them a bigger tip, or is going to order more things, because they associate wealth and success with whiteness. And they associate poverty and everything else with people who look like them, right? So that's an issue that I have witnessed, not just in Africa, but also in the Caribbean all the time, right? Is that if when white people are there, they're literally fawning all over them. I will see, people, women, like literally prostituting themselves to get the attention of white men, because they think that they're the gold standard, right? I've seen all kinds of things that I won't even get into this video. And these things play out in America too. I call it the scandal effect. But my thing is, none of that stuff is going to serve you in the end. And this is not me criticizing interracial relationships or any of those things. I believe love is love. You love who you love. You pick who you love. But some people need to examine the why of some of these things and the why they think. And some of us don't want to do that kind of intellectual exercise. But I'm just saying that all of these things are impacted. The desire and belief that whiteness is better is something that is very, 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 very much part of the Caribbean culture, right? I know this. I've been in these islands. My family's from these islands. I know the history of a lot of these islands, and it's very obvious when you go to a lot of these islands that it's still a thing. And it's the same on the continent of Africa, and the same when you go to Asia, right? When you go to Bali and you go to some of these places, you see, I remember being in Bali and I'm seeing people out in the hot sun covering themselves from head to toe. And then someone explained to me it was because the people did not want their skin to get dark. They want to keep their skin white. And you will see people putting on this very white, light makeup on their faces that doesn't even match their skin, because they're trying to look white. You'll go into stores all over the world, not just in Asia, and you see so many skin lightening products in the Caribbean. You'll see it in the drugstores in Africa. You'll see it in Asia. People are literally lightening their skin on purpose. Because why? They want to be light. There is a whole caste system in India. It's fascinating. You should read about it. And if you read the book Caste, by Isabel Wilkerson, which I highly recommend, and I will link in the description to this video. She talks about the similarities between the caste system in India and the caste system in the United States. And then, of course, there was a caste system in South Africa. But all of these things are based on the principle that whiteness and the closest proximity, as close to proximity you have in white skin and whiteness, the better you are. Okay, and that you're better. And so you got to understand these things to understand how sometimes people interact and often interact in workplaces, right? So the other thing you have to understand is when people come to America as immigrants, they come for opportunity. People believe that America is the land of milk and honey. They believe the concept of the American dream, which is one of the biggest lies ever perpetrated ever. They believe those things. You need to also understand American media is global and has been for a very long time. So a lot of times when people watch TV, all they watch is TV is American TV. When I was a kid and we moved to Trinidad when I was 9, my dad got a job there. We lived there for 7 years and then we came back to the United States. And I remember the TV, TV in America, you had lots of channels. Cable hadn't existed, but cable was just about to begin. But those things didn't exist in the Caribbean. TV used to come on at about 8 in the morning and it would go off at around midnight. Okay. And the first thing that came on TV in the morning was Sesame Street. First thing. And then a lot of other TV shows that were American TV shows. Right. And this is not unusual. This is common in the Caribbean and common in other parts of the world. Even when they dubbed the TV shows in other languages, it's American television. And so the concept of America has been sent all over the world as the gold standard. And also the negative images of Black American people have also been sent all over the world globally. And so if as a child, you have never met a Black person in your life or a Black American person in your life, but when you watch Law and Order and you watch this criminal procedural show on TV and you watch anything, honestly, you would begin to believe that all Black Americans are in gangs, they're violent, they're dangerous, because that's all you've ever seen on American television. And I think it's important to understand that because people come to America, they have this concept of what America is. They figure out later that it's a lie, but first they got to get here to figure that out. And they, again, have already historically associated goodness and being smarter and more intellectually superior and success and money with whiteness. And that's what they're aspiring to. If you're aspiring to success, you're aspiring to that. Okay? Then you come to America, right? And then the people that you've seen on TV that are also scary and dangerous, right? You see them for the first time, but you already have a belief about those people, because you've never ever met one before. And you believe that in order to be successful, you have to aspire to whiteness and aspire to proximity to whiteness in order to be successful. What do you think? How do you think that's going to play out when you get into the workplace? And so I think that has a huge impact on the way that people of color from all over the world interact with Black people, Black American people, when they come to America. And it's not just Latinos and it's not just Asians, whether they be, Korean or Chinese or Japanese or Indian. It's not just people from the Middle East, right? It's all people, including people from the continent of Africa, including people from the Caribbean, because a lot of them come with the concept that, if you come to America, you get to America, you work hard, you get an education, and you'll be successful. And they don't understand how those Black people can be in America and they're not successful. It must be that they're not working hard enough. And they don't understand until they experience it that there's a whole structure put in place to ensure that even when you go to school, even when you get an education, even when you're the smartest, fastest one in the room, there is a system in place to ensure that you are still going to be treated differently and you're still going to be viewed as being inferior and you're still going to be a second-class citizen. And when people start to recognize it, what their usual response initially is that, well, maybe if I work harder and I get more closer to these white people, they won't treat me the way they treat the Black American people. So I need to get closer to them, not realizing the light bulb doesn't go off right away that you have a common enemy with the Black American people. Instead, it's like, well, maybe if I get even more closer to them, they won't treat me the way they treat them, right? Because white people communicate very early in the workplace, in my experience, that in order for you to be successful, you must pledge allegiance to them. And that also means many times turning on people that look like you. And they will often send people of color and Black people to do the dirty work for them, if you're willing to do it. And you'll get rewarded for it. You'll get promoted. You'll get all these different things. And so I've always said, when I go in an organization, especially when it comes to HR, and I see a person of color or a Black person and they tell me, I've been here for 20 years, I immediately know that they can't be trusted. Because if you can work in HR for 20 years, right, and move up and become a vice president or whatever, and you've been there that long, you done sold some people out. You have sold some people out. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, you won't last that long. You won't last that long because you won't be able to do the things that they want you to do. So when you're telling me I've been there for 20 years and I've moved up from this to this and this place has a lot of opportunity, I know something's not right with you. And so what I'm trying to convey is that the reason why these things happen the way they do, at the end of the day, all roads lead to white supremacy. All roads lead there, always. And so, yes, these things, that doesn't make it okay, and it's not an excuse, but it's important for us as Black American people to understand what the motivation of this stuff is and where it comes from, right? I remember coming into a company, and I'm having a conversation with someone, and he's British, and he stops and he says to me, you're really different. You're not like them. And I immediately stopped him and said, first of all, who is them and what are you talking about? And he immediately started backpedaling. You know why? Because I didn't take it as a compliment. I didn't smile when he said it. I didn't say thank you. I immediately was like, what is that supposed to mean? Who is them? Who is them? Right? And so, I think it's important for us to realize that every single one of us, when you go into these work environments, gets tested at some point to see whether you're one of the kind of people that can be used against your own. And it's individual up to every single one of us to decide when that test comes that we're not going to be that person. And unfortunately, many of us, people of color and Black people, fail that test. And we fail it because we're afraid. We fail it because we want to succeed, and we're willing to throw a couple of, our own under the bus to get there. That's why we fail it. And we think not getting the pat on the head would be the failure. But I think throwing your own people over is the real failure, right? And so people of color also, including African people, don't have the history and the legacy that Black American people have. They don't understand the legacy of slavery. They didn't experience slavery, but they did experience colonialism. But a lot of them do not have the ability to see the parallels between colonialism and slavery. And that all of us have experienced oppression at the hands of whiteness and white supremacy. It's just, what did it come packaged as, right? And you have to understand that the system of white supremacy and hyper-capitalism that is at play in the United States only works if you can pit groups and classes of people against each other. The day that people would wake up and realize that we all have one common enemy, the whole thing would fall apart. And so there's a concerted effort made by the system, which is really a system created and maintained by very wealthy white people for the most part, but primarily by rich people, is to ensure through the media, especially, that people stay divided and they stay afraid of each other. Because if people were to really stop and realize who the common enemy is, the whole thing would go to hell really, really fast. And so historically, anytime that there's been any movement to unite poor people of color, Black people, and just poor people generally, whoever's been trying to create that ended up good and dead. Ask Martin Luther King. Right? Ask what was his name? Fred. What was his name? Uh Judas and the Black Messiah. If you've seen that movie, you know Fred Hampton. Ask Fred Hampton. Because the whole system, the system requires the division of people. It requires it. It can't work without it. And so, as long as people are aspiring to what they believe success looks like, the car, the house, the things, all the things, they're willing to throw each other overboard for it. Not only black people, but their own. And everyone comes into the United States and learns very quickly that there is a caste system, whether we call it that or not. So at the turn of the century, when the Jews and the Italians and the Irish came to America, they were at the bottom of the caste system, right? The Irish were at the very bottom, and the Italians and the Jews, right? And over time, they were able to become white. They weren't white right away. And there's a book that was written about how, there's several books, but there's a really great book that was written about how the Italians and the Irish became white. And if I can find it, I will link it in the description. But one of the requirements was that over time, some of these people became some of the most virulently anti-black racists that you're ever going to find. You ain't never seen a real racist till you experience a really racist Irish or Italian, right? But at the turn, their ancestors were treated horribly when they came to America. Primarily the ones that came to America were the Southern Italians and Sicilians, right? And the way that some of them were treated was horrible, right? But some of them, became, for in the Irish case, they joined the police force, right? And that's how they assimilated. They were some of the workers in the mines and all of those things. And some of them were displaced by the Chinese and then turned on the Chinese. And there's all that history. And who got them fighting against each other? The rich white people who didn't want to pay the Irish what they deserved. So they brought in the Chinese that they could pay less. It's always rich white people at the root of it all. But people are always so busy fighting that they don't see it, right? And the system doesn't work without the fighting and the division. So over time, they were allowed to become white. But one of the entryways to becoming white is to become anti-black. And so you see it with Latino Americans, especially the Anglo Latinos, but the Afro ones too, who don't, you'll go to Dominican Republic and have people blacker than me tell you they're not black. All of these things are born out of colonialism, right? And so they'll come to America and they embrace anti-blackness because it is an entry point in their view to become American. And they desperately want to be American. Black Americans don't have that experience because we our ancestors came, your ancestors mostly, because my slave ancestors were brought to the Caribbean, and I luckily had a grandfather who taught my mom about it, and she then taught me. But most Caribbean people don't even have that knowledge of who their African ancestors are, right? But most Black Americans, those who are their ancestors were brought to the United States as slaves, right? They don't have that experience of aspiring to whiteness in that way or aspiring to be American in that way, because you're already American. You were brought here and you didn't even ask to come to the party. While other people have died, trying to come by foot, plane, train, automobile, any way they could get here. We are here and we are a big part of what makes America, America. Black Americans are what make America, America. All the positive things pretty much that other people associate with American is Black American culture. It's Black American culture everywhere in the world. I don't care where you go in the world. You're going to hear Michael Jackson. There are two people you're going to hear no matter where you go in the world. You're going to hear some Bob Marley and you're going to hear some Michael Jackson. I don't care where you go. You could be in freaking Belgrade, which is I've been, and you're going to hear some Beat It coming out of somebody's speakers. Every positive thing, and when you talk to foreign people about what they associate with Americans primarily all derived from Black culture, pretty much, even though they don't realize it. And so people come here, they desperately want to be American, and to them, part of being American requires anti-Blackness. And so they go full throttle into it. Added to that is that many people who come have come with very little or nothing. And all they have is who they are and the community that they build when they come here, which is made up of people from where they came from. Everywhere when people come to America, they first seek out people who are from where they came from. If they're lucky, they'll find some, especially if you go to places like New York, other major cities, right? And so as a child, I remember primarily everybody around me in New York was from the Caribbean. The thing is that the communities that people build are all people that they know and people that look like them. So they also don't have interactions with people that are different from them, except when they go to work. Those are the only interactions they really have. And so the interactions that they have with white people and with black people are going to shape their whole perspective about that group. So if they have one negative experience, they're going to think all black people are bad because I had this one experience over here. So the next job I go to, this is how I'm going to deal with them, right? And a lot of times, who hired you? It wasn't a black person that hired you, it was a white person that hired you. So you feel a certain level of loyalty and also the belief that you need to have proximity. So if they ask you to do something, even though it's against somebody who looks more like you than them, you're going to comply. So there's a whole psyche that comes with that I think people need to understand. And I think a lot of people of color don't even recognize it themselves till later. They realize how problematic it is and how problematic the system is. Because I've had conversations with my dad. My dad's in his 90s. And we've had conversations and he kind of talks to me about when he realized something was wrong with America. And it wasn't right away. Right? You don't realize it because you're busy working hard, trying to take care of your family, trying to do whatever. And you don't realize right away that there's something wrong with the larger system outside of you because you're just trying to get through it. Right? You have to take the time to start to see what's going on around you and like why are these kinds of ideas and images about people perpetrated and perpetuated, right, through television, media, everything, because it benefits a system for people to be divided and to not like each other. And so when you go into the workplaces and you see, Latino and Latina people of color being horrible to black people, and you see Indians and Asians, generally Indians, but also people of Chinese and Japanese and other descent being horrible to people of color. And I think it comes from the desire for white proximity, first and foremost, and then the belief that black Americans aren't working hard enough. And if they worked harder, they could have access to things, when the reality is that immigrants can often come into America and be more successful than black Americans are, because black Americans have been shut out of a lot of the support systems that even immigrants get to have, right? But people don't realize that and they don't see it. Most of them never see it. And then some of them see it later, right? And so I think it's important to understand that the reason that, in my opinion, a lot of these divisions exist and these issues exist in the workplace is because people come in with preconceived notions about black Americans and vice versa. Because I've seen it happen both ways in workplaces. But primarily I have seen it coming from the immigrants coming in with preconceived notions about black American people, right? And then it feeds off of it. So then the person has a bad experience. Then the next time they go to another workplace and they encounter anybody who's an immigrant, the guards are up that this person's a problem because I had a bad experience with this other person over there. But at the end of the day, it really just benefits whiteness and white supremacy for all of these things to happen and for them to continue to happen. And so in my perspective, the most important thing that we can all do as people of color is to examine and question the things that we have been taught and that society has told us about each other, right? And ask yourself, well, why do I think that is true? Why do I believe this to be true, right? Because I see the same kind of behavior that I have historically seen between non-black people of color and black Americans also happening, as I said, between Africans who are black people from a racial perspective. But in Africa, there's no such thing as race on the continent. You go to our countries, everybody's black. So people more divide themselves by tribe, what tribe you are from, but they don't think of color. It's only when they come to America that they find out they're black, because you find out real fast you're black when you come to America. And even in the Caribbean, it's more class, because that's inherited from colonialism and the British. Primarily, you go to islands that were colonized by the British. There's a lot of class divisions about the haves and the have-nots, right? Which capitalism requires. But people don't think in terms of, and there is color issues. There's definitely a lot of colorism in the Caribbean and in South America. Big colorism issues that come out of colonization as well. But there's not race in the concept and the way that it is in America, in a very rigid way that it is in America. And so that's an adjustment people also have. And nobody wants to be black. Everybody wants to be as close as possible to white that they can be, because they realize being black means that you're going to be treated poorly. That's really the biggest thing. You're going to be treated poorly. And also, so for Africans who I have seen, engage in very problematic behavior against Black Americans in workplaces, it becomes an issue of trying to say you're African, you're not Black American, so that you can differentiate yourself. Caribbean people too. I'm not Black American, I'm Jamaican. Jamaican is not a race, it's a country. It's not even an ethnicity, it's a country and a culture. That ain't a race, you Black. Sorry to have to break it to you. You might just be Jamaican in Jamaica, but in America, you're Black. Deal with it. But people try to, throw up all these labels because they want the proximity to whiteness, because they don't want to be treated the way that Black American people are treated. So their response is to try to differentiate and separate themselves. And the best way to do that is to victimize Black American people so they can suck up to the white person and say, see what I did? I'm on your side. I'm like you. But you're not, and they know it. And whenever they need to, you're going to get your wake-up call, in the words of the great late Paul Mooney. You're going to get your wake-up call, because we all get it. We all get it. We all will learn that in the end, white proximity will not save you. And when it comes down to it, as Toni Morrison said, who's my hero, my shero, they will not choose you. When the chips are down, they will not choose you. Especially if it's between you and one of them, they will not choose you. I don't care what you did for them. I don't care what dirty work you did for them. They're not going to choose you. So don't sell your soul out for their approval and their proximity, because in the end, they will not choose you. It will not save you, and it will not serve you. And so I think that more of us need to educate ourselves about the history of all of these things and where it comes from. And then we have to intentionally seek to unlearn the biases that America and whiteness and white supremacy teaches you to have as individuals, and the stereotypes that it teaches you to have, to help you divide yourselves and to keep the system going, because the system can't work without all these divisions. So that is my kind of perspective about some of these things. I think these are real issues in the workplace. And that it's important for people to recognize that these things exist. And if you see them happening, if you see or have a Black supervisor that is clearly showing anti-Black bias and doing things that favor people who are white and or people who are only from their group, you got to document that stuff, because it's illegal. That's discrimination. You're not allowed to do that. But you have to carefully document it, very carefully, because it gets harder and harder to prove. People are less likely to want to listen to what you're saying when you're talking about same race discrimination than when you're talking about other kinds of discrimination. So it's important to document carefully. And I experienced this personally, so I'm telling you, it's important to document carefully every type of differential treatment you experience, and every time you see them doing something that favors the other group, so that you can raise these issues effectively when you need to. But these things are real and they do happen. And I think it's important for us to know and understand why they happen, and to recognize them and to push back against them as much as possible. I hope this video was helpful. I'm sure there will be lots of comments about it. Just please keep them constructive and respectful. This is Anne Marie, the anti-HR HR lady. HR is not your enemy, but it's definitely not your friend, but I am. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.